Welcome, everybody, to episode 24 of Generation Jihad. I can't believe it's 24 episodes already, huh, Bill?
Crazy. 24 now.
The dirty 24, I guess you would say. We're recording this in late August, folks, and we're working on new episodes for the fall, new thematic episodes on different topics you may be interested in. This episode today is going to be more of a sort of a news roundup as we approach the November election, presidential election here in the United States, and sort of how the U.S. is sort of moving the pieces around the board and changing its military posture and what's going on in the jihadi scene. But before we run into these topics, we're going to cover a little bit on Iraq, we're going to cover a little bit on Afghanistan, we're going to hit Somalia, talk about how things have been evolving across those three different jihadi theaters. But before we do that, I guess I will reiterate our plea for you guys to get on Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star review or rating. And the more of you that do that, the better. I've been informed. Again, if people that know me, including Bill, know that I am completely incompetent when it comes to computers and technology. I've got a phobia, really, of computers, so I know nothing about this. But apparently I've been informed by Phil Hegseth, who works on these podcasts for us, that there's an algorithm of some sort that goes in and drives people to your show when you get 5-star ratings. So I hope you do that. We greatly appreciate that, right, Bill? Do you know anything about this? I don't know anything about this.
Yeah, listen, the better the reviews, the better we're going to rise in the standings. Just support us, folks. Give us 5 stars. Give us a nice review.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I just don't know really how this all specifically works.
I don't really either, Tom. I just kind of made it up.
What is internet anyway? What do you mean? How does one? What do you write to it like mail?
Yeah, well, it sounds good. So, you know, as we're heading into November here, so we're recording this on August 31st. We're in the waning days of summer, and we're heading into the fall here. And as we head into November, one of the big themes you're going to see, and we've talked about this on previous episodes of the podcast, is sort of this idea of the endless wars, the forever wars. Both President Trump and Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden, have pledged to basically end the endless wars. We've talked about the sort of problems with that in the past. I think if you're sort of a blame America first isolationist, that sort of rhetoric appeals to you, but you don't have to be just an ideologue. I mean, I think it appeals a lot of Americans not wanting to have to send Americans abroad to fight in all these different theaters, all these places that people don't understand. But we try and provide a little context to understand what the jihadis are doing in these places, and specifically anti-American jihadis. And so it's a little bit of a different take than sort of what you may get from other quarters. Again, you know, I think, Bill, I don't disagree with the idea that America doesn't want to be in these places indefinitely. I get that, right? I mean, we don't have any problem with that. I think I have a problem with the idea that it's America's presence in these places that's keeping these wars going, which I don't think is true at all.
Yeah, that's really the issue. I mean, Tom and I, neither of us wants our country to be at war, but these are actions we must take against an enemy that is committed to fighting us and committed to destroying our way of life. It's just that. Well,
some would say we don't even have to. It's not actually we have to take. I mean, I've seen some of these people. You know, basically their argument is we don't really need to fight ISIS or Al Qaeda. Okay, you can make that argument. I disagree with that. I think, you know, we do have to take some actions. The other thing I saw, Bill, before we, sorry, I cut you off, but let me ask you a question about this.
That's okay.
Before we get into the meat of this, there's a word that bothers me. I see bandied about sometimes. You see sort of these hacks say, well, you know, jihadism is an existential threat to the U.S., so therefore we can't treat it as an existential threat. Well, I'd say 2 things about that. One, what the heck do you mean by existential threat? I mean, I don't even know what that means. It's not even defined, really. And as a corollary to number 1, you can have awfully nasty things that can threaten Americans and American way of life without being existential, right? It doesn't have to end America's way of being in order to be particularly nasty. 9/11 was particularly nasty. There have been other things that have been particularly nasty throughout time. That don't have to necessarily be existential. But the second thing is America isn't treating this as an existential threat anyway, right? I mean, we documented multiple times America has pivoted away from these large-scale conflicts against the jihadis. As we're recording this, our best estimate, Bill, is what? It's less than 30,000 American troops are deployed in jihadi theaters, whether they be Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, or across Africa. That's not treating this as an existential threat. I don't think anybody is, right, Bill?
No, you're absolutely correct. We're not treating it as such. You and I don't believe it's, you know, an existential threat in the sense of, well, they could push a button and launch a nuclear war or anything like that. But as you said, 9/11 was quite nasty. It cost this country in numerous ways. And we need to prevent threats such as that. And just because we or some individuals think that, the jihadist dream of establishing a global caliphate is fanciful, it doesn't mean that it's something that we shouldn't fight. It's, you know, these. I'm with you, Tom. I hate this when it's basically this all or nothing.
It's a straw man. Yeah, it's a straw man.
It's
a straw man. It's convenient to say, well, I mean, because by that token, what is an existential threat? Most of the problems on the globe probably don't. You could define existential in such a way that basically so many things aren't existential, right? That aren't an existential threat.
Yeah, right. I mean, if the North Korea builds a missile that could only nuke Hawaii, is that an existential threat to the United States? To the state of Hawaii, it is,
right.
But. We could do that. We could play this game all day. The reality is we need to remain engaged in certain areas. We need to fight our enemies in certain areas, or we can concede these areas to them. And if we do that, it causes problems. Look, when we ignored Al Qaeda during the 1990s. Basically, we thought that launching some cruise missiles into empty tents and killing some camels would take care of the problem, while trusting the Taliban to keep a lid on them. It didn't. And you get
actually, the U.S. government didn't even trust the Taliban back then. It's only now that the State Department's pretending that we could trust the Taliban. The U.S. the Clinton administration didn't trust the Taliban. You can go to the 9/11 Commission report, and the Bush administration certainly didn't. Neither one of them did. So it's only now that we're playing this game, which we're going to get into. This is our favorite sort of pinatas to hit this one. We're going to hit this one again in this episode. Because it's the ongoing absurdity of all that. But the point is that the U.S. is going to have some sort of counterterrorism presence. I think only when I mentioned the Blame America First ideologues, I think you can have a lot of misgivings about all this, a lot of criticisms about all this without falling into that camp. Sure, absolutely. There's plenty to debate. But the ideologues in particular are drawn to this language because they think that you can just basically, all American forces can melt away and we don't have to worry about it. It'll all just sort of cancel out. And there's just so many reasons why that's false. I mean, the counterfactual world in which America did that, let's say America did that a decade ago and President Obama had completed his full withdrawal and maintained it. What do you think the world would look like today? ISIS would have a caliphate. Nobody stood in ISIS's caliphate, the caliphate's way. Al Qaeda would have more gains in different places. Who knows how many plots that were thwarted overseas would have come through. That's sort of a difficult, thorny subject, but certainly some of them would have. So I mean, this idea that the U.S. can just sort of put its head back in the sand and pretend like this is all going to go away is foolish. Now, on the other hand, neither one of us is arguing for some sort of major coin-style effort here, right, Bill? Those days are
absolutely not. Those days are gone. Yeah,
those days are over. So let's talk a little bit about how the U.S. as we approach November is sort of changing its force posture, or is sort of reconfiguring things. One of the big announcements in recent weeks was this continued drawdown in Iraq. Bill, why don't you take that? Why don't you walk viewers through that a little bit? What's going on in Iraq and where the administration is on this? And I'll inject one thing after you go through all that. I'll talk a little bit about why I think the President Trump's sort of language on Iraq is a little disingenuous. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking forward to that. I know exactly what you're going to say. But so last week, the U.S. evacuated its troops from a base in a town called Taji. It's just north.
Have you been there,
Baghdad.
Bill, when you were embedded in Iraq?
Taji is one place I've not been in Iraq. Just didn't get an opportunity. When I was in the Baghdad areas in central, southern, and eastern and western Baghdad, but northern didn't make it that area. Probably flew over it, but it's a major hub. Back in 2014, when the Islamic State was literally marching on Baghdad, Taji was where the line in the sand was drawn with Iraqi security forces who were reeling, and so it's a key area. It's a key sort of a maintenance depot and training center all rolled up in one. So the U.S. had about 1,500 troops, 2,000 troops there. They pulled them out. It's unclear where they went, if they've been fully withdrawn or if they've been moved to other bases within Iraq. So right now the U.S. has about 5,200 troops. The Trump administration recently announced it's withdrawing about 1/3 of those troops, or about 1,500 troops. But the administration, as you mentioned, Tom, and I'll leave it to you, the administration's message is muddled. They want to end the endless wars, but they're not going to commit to a full withdrawal in Iraq. Look, it's like either you're in this or you're out. There's no half pregnant on this issue. I mean, that's how, you're hearing Trump say, let's get out, let's end these endless wars, but we won't do a full withdrawal. Look, in my opinion, either we're in Iraq and we're going to help the Iraqi government and we're going to do some things to block Iranian expansion. Oh, and by the way, if the U.S. fully withdrew from Iraq. They're likely, or the Islamic State would likely have a caliphate in areas in Iraq, and the Iranians probably would own the other half of the country, and that's a bad idea. That would certainly, not in American interests or in the interests of its allies. The Islamic State's far from defeated in Iraq, and Iranian influence in Iraq grows daily. Without an American presence, there is zero that could be done to stop either problem.
Yeah, and this goes to the part of the problem with the endless wars rhetoric, right? Is that the jihadis are organized as insurgents. Neither ISIS nor Al Qaeda is close to defeat. I don't think we're going to defeat them anytime soon, nor should we try and put the resources into defeating them at this point. I think that those days are gone. But the point is, on Iraq, can you maintain a smaller footprint to help the Iraqi government and sort of advance American interests? And as you mentioned, there's just over 5,000 American soldiers in Iraq. There's contractors, there's other support personnel of some sort, of course. But this isn't, the massive surge level effort that we saw at the height of the Iraq War. It's something much smaller than that. I noticed before I move on, I saw the U.S.-led coalition announce the transfer of $347 million in property and equipment to the Iraqi security forces at Camp Taji. $347 million. I mean, that's sort of probably a rounding error on the Iraq War overall, which has cost us cost American taxpayers a lot of money, a lot of wasted money, of course, which is a legitimate criticism, of course, of all this. But overall, of course, the U.S. isn't spending that amount of money now, isn't spending what it was spending at the height of the surge. What I think is interesting about this, though, is the political rhetoric on this is just so dishonest, so disingenuous. So earlier this month, President Trump got up there with the new prime minister of Iraq, and they were talking about, the continued partnership between the U.S. and Iraq. Now, of course, President Trump gets on Twitter and his media circuits go out and they blast the endless wars, and they talk about how President Trump is against the endless wars and he's going to get America out of them against those nefarious neocons who are keeping us in, which is all, folks, this is bullshit, right? I don't know who the neocons are. They certainly, there were a handful of them during the Bush years. Certainly none of those people have any influence today. None of them are making policy today. And if President Trump wanted to get all of American forces out of Iraq, he could, right? He could do that tomorrow, right? I mean, you could just say, well, we're getting out, bye, and basically could withdraw forces. But instead, so President Trump gets up there at this press briefing, and so now he, on the one hand, he and his surrogates are demonizing their political opposition, domestic political opposition, which is really a character which really doesn't even really exist, to be honest with you, as neocons and warmongers and all this stuff and endless wars. And on the other hand, President Trump does this press briefing with the Prime Minister of Iraq, and he's pressed on this. He says, he's asked by a reporter, reporter asks, well, are you going to withdraw from Iraq totally within 3 years, as some have reported? And he wouldn't commit to that. He wouldn't even commit to a full withdrawal within 3 years. He said, so at some point, we obviously will be gone. That's what he said. But we brought it down to a very, very low level. And he basically justified this much reduced presence in Iraq. He said, we've got a small presence there now, a very small presence there. And he wouldn't commit to drawing it down any further or leaving entirely, even though the U.S. is cutting some of the forces. It's just sort of the complete, just this discord here and all this in the political rhetoric, this disconnect, between, on the one hand, politically telling your base, I'm here in Washington fighting those who want to keep the endless wars going. On the other hand, the president is asked about this specifically, whether or not you're going to totally get out. And he just says, he basically talks around it and says, you know what, we have a very small presence there. And he justifies it on both military and his own economic way of looking at things. Right, Bill?
Yeah, Tom. Yeah, absolutely. Look, if the policy is withdraw the troops from Iraq, I think it's a bad idea, but certainly within the rights of the President of the United States to do so. Then do it. But stop this end the endless wars talk when you're not willing to actually do it. It's extremely annoying, and I gotta imagine it's frustrating for those who have to serve in Iraq as well. And I'm going to make one quick point on that: $347 million in property and equipment going to the Iraqi security forces. I think we all know what happened the last time U.S. left Iraq and transferred a lot of hardware. Just Google Islamic State and Humvee, and then you could see all of that military hardware being used by the Islamic State to slaughter people in Syria and in Iraq, and to take over an area of both Iraq and Syria that was the size of Britain. Look, these decisions have implications. We pretend, again, I'm going to repeat myself here. We pretend we could end these endless wars, but the fact is the jihadists are not going to end these wars. We're just going to end our involvement. Let's be honest about this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point. Is what bothers me about this is that on the one hand, you have President and his challenger, Vice President Biden, who we talked about in the previous episode of the podcast, going off on the forever wars, endless wars. Okay, he can make plenty of reasonable critiques of them, sure. But on the other hand, not committing to fully withdrawing American forces from any of these places, and not only not refusing to make that commitment, or not just not following through and not doing it, but not justifying it. Not, only during this press briefing is President Trump give his sort of an ad hoc sort of justification for this. But if you're a service member, American service member serving one of these places, what does it got to feel like to you to be out there in Iraq or Afghanistan or one of these places, and you hear sort of a half-hearted defense of what you're doing, and you don't hear any real American leadership sort of giving you an unequivocal defense of what your mission is? That's bothersome to me. I mean, if I were a service member, that would bother me. I mean, you can't.
Yeah, not only that, like, so you don't have support for your mission, but if you're out there fighting these endless wars, you're actually demeaning what they're doing. You're making them complicit they're endless warriors in a sense. And, so people like you and I who are sitting there, or those who are serving, that are sitting there saying, hey, look, there's some kind of need here. We need to determine what that is. I agree. We should have a minimal presence, have the bare minimum to do what furthers our interests. But, we're called warmongers and things like that, or, people who
I don't get that very often, and I don't think you either. Yeah.
No, but that's essentially...
That's the rhetoric that President Trump and others are engaging in general, though. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Right. I mean, that really, if you refuse to end the endless wars, what are you then? Right. You're, by definition, you're someone who wants to remain in war. So you're, by definition, a warmonger. I mean, and so that's why this is really offensive. Like, make the case to fully withdraw from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Africa, from all these places. If you like, make the case. But I'm just frustrated with continually hearing this and then leaving American troops in Iraq.
To that point, too, President Trump got on Twitter and he went after GOP conference chair Liz Cheney, Congresswoman from Wyoming, who's supportive of the president, who's expressed her misgivings and reservations and criticisms of the withdrawal deal with the Taliban and other issues that the president has taken, and other policy courses the president has set. But, he gets on Twitter and he says she's just upset because I'm trying to end America's involvement, or these endless wars, right? Well, wait a minute. I don't think Congresswoman Liz Cheney is what's keeping the endless wars going, even if she has criticisms and does what she does, on the Hill. The Taliban's keeping that war going in Afghanistan. ISIS is keeping that war going in Iraq and Syria. So is Al-Qaeda in different places, including Afghanistan, by the way. I mean, there's this, impugning of motives, which is what I think you're getting at, Bill, which bothers me.
Yeah. Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
It's like, give me a break. Don't impugn my motives or impugn some of these motives for saying, look, we need to fight terrorists or fight jihadists. I mean, that's ridiculous. You can say how much you want to do that, but that speaks to the ideology of all this, right? It's only an ideologue would say, the real problem isn't, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The real problem is, some Republican Congress member or some politician or some talking head or one of us nerds or whatever, and that's sort of it's shifting the moral weight from the terrorists to other Americans. And that's really bothersome. It really bothers them.
Other Americans who are concerned about all Americans' national security. I mean, I'd happily sit down and have a debate on how we should fight this enemy. I understand that people are reluctant to commit American troops to do so. I mean, so we should be trying to get it right, not as you said, impugn people's motives for doing it.
Yeah, and again, we see the rise of the blame America first isolationist sentiment now, of course, on the left and right. And I don't think you can reason with those people. That doesn't mean that all criticisms, or you can't make a legitimate, rational case against the presence of America in any of these theaters. I think you can. Obviously, you can. I think you and I probably could critique the war in Afghanistan better than any of the harshest critics, right? But it goes to this sort of shifting the moral weight for this stuff from the jihadists, from the terrorists, from the actual bad guys to other Americans and other people who have opinions on this stuff, and it just seems to be pretty noxious to me. So that's what's going on in Iraq. Again, that's just over 5,000 troops there, and they're drawing down even further from Iraq. I mean, whatever. I don't really have an opinion on what the right number is in Iraq. Do you, Bill? I don't really know what the right number should be.
No, I mean, the right number is going to be to carry out your mission. I mean, that's to me, I don't care about numbers. I care about, do we have the forces available in places to execute the mission? That's what matters. If that number is 3,000, great. If it's 1,000, that's fantastic. If it's 7,000, let's go with that. Let's figure it out. We need to clearly define the mission and then get the resources in there to execute. That's what's important. It's this number game, extremely frustrating. It's just I think it's just all politics to just be able to say, look, I've withdrawn troops from Iraq. I'm drawing down and I'm trying to end this. But I'm at the point here, Tom, where either we commit to doing what we actually want to do or just get out and let the consequences be damned. I mean, that's where I kind of am on this. I realize that's sort of throwing my hands up in the air, but at some point, what are we doing did it matter that we have 5,200 and now we're going to 30? Is that the right number to achieve the mission? Or is it just because we want to reduce our footprint in Iraq? If it's the latter, then just pull them out. We're not there doing what we need to. They're not there doing what they need to do.
So let's move to Somalia, where the fight against Shabab, Al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa and Somalia, continues. AFRICOM in recent days, we're recording this again on August 31st and August 28th. AFRICOM came out with a new statement saying they've carried out 46 airstrikes in 2020 against Shabab. And if you look at the AFRICOM statement, I read it as AFRICOM, this is U.S. Africa Command, as essentially laying out the case for the ongoing mission, to sort of remind people what Shabab is, using language. And for example, they say Shabab is a dangerous enemy that presents a threat to Somalia, its neighbors, and the United States. The Al-Qaeda-aligned terrorist organization increasingly employs lies, engages in criminal acts, and blends into communities to create fear and intimidate local populations. And AFRICOM kind of goes on to sort of build their case in this statement that they put out. I find it, I think everything AFRICOM is saying in the statement is accurate. I mean, you and I fought the Disconnect the Dots crowd on Shabab years ago. We remember that old debate. We're going to do a whole episode on that. The Disconnect the Dots crowd was all Shabab isn't really Al-Qaeda. Whoops, you were wrong. Of course, I don't, we're still waiting for you guys to admit you were wrong. But we're going to deal with that in a future episode. Shabab remains openly loyal to Al-Qaeda to this day, and Al-Qaeda's Emir Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they fought the ISIS's attempted expansion in Somalia, where ISIS still has a small presence and does carry out attacks in Mogadishu and elsewhere. But Shabab has successfully quashed basically that sort of insurrection against the Emir of Shabab within the jihadi ranks. But again, there's a disconnect, right, Bill, between, on the one hand, you have U.S. AFRICOM laying out the case, explaining why they're continuing to fight Shabab on behalf of our Somali partners. And on the other hand, you have the endless or forever wars rhetoric. It's sort of this schizophrenia on all this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, of all the commands out there, CENTCOM and, really the two main commands that are engaged are CENTCOM and AFRICOM in this war. But AFRICOM gets it right. I mean, I have one thing I disagree in that statement, and I realize I'm nitpicking. And AFRICOM, I'm sorry, it's not
aligned, right? Yeah, I thought the same thing.
Aligned group. It's Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's Al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa. That's
the aligned word bothered me too.
Nitpicking.
It's not nitpicking. The aligned word bothered me too because it doesn't sound as organic as it is, right? Right.
Yeah, exactly. It's making it seem like, whereas when we do this Shabab episode, you'll see the close-knit ties between, going back decades, between what became Shabab and Al-Qaeda's general command. And it's
the Disconnected Daughters got that wrong on the Bin Laden files. They got that wrong on what the group was doing at different times. We're going to get into all that. But the point is, I mean, it still is a wholly vested member of the Al-Qaeda network. It's a branch of Al-Qaeda. And, I've heard from people that the Shabab's Emir, probably plays a bigger role within Al-Qaeda globally than people realize. We're going to get into all that. But the point is, here you have AFRICOM saying, here's the ongoing mission, right, Bill? And this is why we're doing what we're doing. And you don't have any senior politician, political figure, certainly not the President of the United States or anybody else, explaining that and justifying that to the American people. You just have AFRICOM putting out this statement saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. Okay. But you don't have anybody else saying, yeah, you're right, and this is why we need to keep doing it,
Yeah, I mean, you essentially have, the President of the United States dumping on AFRICOM's mission. AFRICOM's, as you said, clearly defining the enemy and explaining the threat to the United States. And AFRICOM is correct about this. I mean, we've had plots emanate from Somalia. Look, I think the first American suicide, first and second, and possibly the third, were in Somalia. They fought for Shabab. So, yeah, look, and here's the thing.
You're talking about
AFRICOM
Americans
gets
who were recruited by Shabab, went off and blew themselves up in Somalia, right?
And blew themselves
right. I mean,
up
you'd have
in
there's
Somalia.
a whole
yes, that's right.
clique of analysts who would discount all that and say, "Who cares? It doesn't bother. That's not a threat to America because they're blowing themselves up in Somalia." Well, okay, you can see how easily that could be turned back around against in Minneapolis or somewhere else, right? So.
Yeah, and what the Osama bin Laden was doing in the deserts of
Didn't
Afghanistan
matter, right?
In 1997.
And the FBI, certainly had to devote a good amount of its resources to disrupting Shabab's networks on American soil, which is, of course, something that people don't discount when they talk about this. But you pointed, Bill, to one of these airstrikes that was done recently. Who's this guy now? He's a Shabab operations chief.
Yeah. They call him Abdul Qadir Commando. I don't know if that's his real name or if that's he certainly thinks a lot of himself. Look, there's been, these strikes, they occasionally take out a member of Shabab's leadership. Sometimes it's network that's plotting to conduct attacks outside the United States. But more often than not, these strikes kill members of Shabab who are supporting the insurgency. Now, Tom and I would all argue that the insurgency aspect of these groups is the lifeblood of these terrorist groups. I just think it's really wrong to even sit there for us to call them terrorist groups. They're terrorist insurgencies. The insurgencies feed the external operations. But the United States has been doing this for over a decade. These strikes, they've kept a lid on, loosely kept a lid on Shabab, but there's no way, it's not a path to victory. Not in Somalia, not in Yemen, not in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Airstrikes or, targeted killing, airstrikes, whatever you want to call them, is a tool within the toolbox. And if your strategy is to keep a lid on it, well, then so be it.
Now, some would say, well, you don't have a strat. We heard this on a lot of these things. You don't have a strategy for victory, therefore you shouldn't do anything. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I mean, there is value in preventing Shabab from forming its emirate in East Africa and becoming this, sort of new, even more so of an exporter of jihadism and projecting its terrorism throughout the region, which we've already seen it does regularly, attacking in Kenya and elsewhere. And so the idea that, basically, America's not going to defeat Shabab anytime soon, and we agree they're not going to, and neither are Somali allies. But that means basically you shouldn't do anything is what you hear people say. And this gets to the problem with the endless wars rhetoric, right? I mean, who's keeping the endless war going? The endless jihadis. That's who's keeping it going, Yeah. And are in fighting not to win, which, by the way, would require a large U.S. or international presence, which, by the way, I do not advocate in Somalia. I think we all remember what happened in the 1990s when the U.S. engaged in Somalia. It was not pretty. That's about as a failed state as you'll get out there, and I don't think that's a good place. But look, there's three options. The difference now, though, is you have a federal government that's allied with the U.S. is trying to take the fight to Shabab, and the U.S. is actively engaged.
Exactly. But so look, you have three options. You could go all in and to help them and try to defeat Shabab. Probably, again, still not a good idea in Somalia. You can keep a lid on the problem. You could help the Somali government, with targeted strikes and continue to train. We all know that that's going to lead to this stalemate, which, by the way, extends this war, or you can get out. I mean, there's not two options. There's three. There is a middle option there where you can find the optimal amount of, resources to devote to the, for the United States to devote to keep it lit. Either AFRICOM is right and Shabab is a threat to the United States, or it's wrong. And it's not. You and I happen to believe it is correct.
Yeah, I think I think you can make the case now, but the problem that we're highlighting here is that outside this AFRICOM statement, nobody else is making the case, and you have a lot of people who are decrying these efforts. I mean, even had, Secretary of Defense Esper and others have intimated that maybe AFRICOM needs to pull back across all of Africa and just get out of this altogether. Yeah. I think that people need to recognize what that actually means and make the explicit argument. What I want to hear people then say is, I don't care if Shabab forms an Islamic emirate in East Africa. That's what you'd have to say then, right? Or I don't care if Al-Qaeda forms an emirate in West Africa. Just make that case. Say you don't care about it and be honest about what it is. Be honest that you don't care and that you're going to discount that threat entirely. Just be honest about it. Because Because otherwise, you're just playing the blame America first game, right? And saying, "Oh, America's keeping this going. It's America being there that's the problem." Well, wait a minute. America's there. Whether you agree, you can disagree with it and say you don't want to put any more resources into it. Okay, you can say you don't want to put anything into it anymore. But be honest about what you say on the other side. Now, there are ideologues in our field even who make those arguments. But I want to hear it more nationally if you're going to really go that route.
Yeah. And if you think that, oh, well, fine, Shabab, it's just some terrorist group. Well, last week it took control of a town outside of the city of Baidoa, which is in western Somalia. Well, what does that mean? Well, Baidoa was the city that its predecessor, the Islamic Courts Union, took control, it took control of that city, and then it started spreading throughout Somalia. And then also over the weekend, the Shabab attacked a U.S. and joint U.S. Somali base outside of the city Kismayo. It's the second largest city in Somalia, and it also was overrun by Shabab and they controlled it for several years before you had to get the Kenyans and African Union with United States help to help drive them out. Shabab already controls 25% of the country. I think if you pull the U.S. resources, you pretty much can guarantee that Shabab will establish an emirate like it did in 2008, 2009, and held on to it for it controlled the capital of Mogadishu, controlled nearly all of central and southern Somalia until an international force had to go in and beat it out. Shabab isn't dead. It's still around. You could either concede this fight to them or you can help keep the lid on it. We all know that the victory option isn't there. And again, Tom and I aren't advocating this, but we do need to do something to keep that lid on it.
So it reminds me too, I remember there was that whole push to blame sort of the jihadism of the Islamic Courts Union, the predecessor to Shabab, on the Ethiopian intervention in Somalia. Remember this, Bill? This was all sort of blame the external forces for what Shabab and its predecessor were, and that was all fictitious history. But again, it points to, when we were going through that back in the day, what people don't realize is, a lot of times in our field in particular, you see this idea that it's the interventionists or people who prefer military support, sort of again impugning motives, that they sort of cook the books to justify it, right? Oh, this is, you're just pretending something is Al-Qaeda because you want to intervene there, which is nonsense. The facts are what they are. But actually, it's the anti-interventionists, it's the people who are opposed to U.S. military using force that more often than not, in my view, have actually politicized their own view of these things or have cooked the books on it. And we see that all the time, saying it's just a pure local force, don't worry about it, who cares, blah, 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 blah. And you see, and blaming other actors for sort of their presence in the international jihad. And that, to me, that's a much more pervasive line of thinking, and I don't even really want to call it thinking, much more pervasive line of sort of attack, pseudo-intellectual analysis than anything that you see, people aren't doing. I mean, look, Shabab is loud and proud about its Al-Qaeda, its role in Al-Qaeda's network. To try and deny that at this point is ridiculous. But you had people years ago trying to do that, even though there was plenty of evidence even then that it was ridiculous, right?
Yeah, it was so enthusiastic about its ties that Al-Qaeda Central, Osama bin Laden, had to tell Sheikh Zubair, was the leader, to hide its ties to keep international aid flowing into famine-stricken areas that Shabab controlled. That's how so Al-Qaeda was sitting there and telling Shabab, look, you could tell your people
that you are Al-Qaeda, that you have a bayah.
You're Al-Qaeda, but no public announcement, no confirmation to the press. Keep it hidden, okay? And look, Al-Qaeda at that time was looking for any type of recognition in the fight. The Shabab,
that whole history was all mangled. We're going to get into that from the Bin Laden files and how that was totally the reading of those files is totally tortured. We're going to get into what actually happened there. Well, let's move back to our favorite theater, Afghanistan, which we have to cover. So U.S. officials told New York Times just in the last day or so, from when we're recording this, and the reporter there is Thomas Gibbons Neff. Am I saying his name right? I hope I'm not butchering his name.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Yes. If I am, Thomas, I apologize. I think he's a former service member himself who's in Afghanistan. And so he has a report up about U.S. officials saying that the Taliban, or a faction of the Taliban, fired rockets at Camp Bastion and Helmand, as well as Camp Dwyer. And the rocket attacks occurred in July and August, and these rocket attacks are allegedly a violation of the U.S. Taliban deal, which was signed on February 29th in Doha. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the deal again, because we just can't get away from it. but the first thing that came to my mind when I saw this was, so, and of course the Taliban denies that they did these rocket attacks. But if you actually look at the text of the agreement that was released to the public, there's nothing in there saying the Taliban's not going to attack these bases. There's nothing in there saying the Taliban has agreed to not attack American forces even. This is apparently an understanding that's either in an annex to the agreement or annexes to the agreement that weren't released to the public, or some sort of verbal understanding or a combination of the two. But it's not actually in the agreement that was released to the public. So the actual agreement we have, the text of the agreement we have, doesn't say anything about Camp Bastion, Camp Dwyer, or other U.S. military facilities. There are these supposed counterterrorism assurances from the Taliban about not allowing al-Qaeda or similar anti-American terrorists to attack the U.S. and its allies. And, basically some are trying to portray this as sort of stringent criteria or stringent parts of the agreement, that these are really sort of strict and that the Taliban has to agree to this stuff. We're going to get into in a second again why that isn't the case. But the bottom line is there's nothing specifically saying in the text, again, the text of the agreement released to the public, that the Taliban can't do this. So I don't know how this is a violation, although other than if it's in the unreleased portions of the text, right, Bill?
Yeah, well, if it's in some unreleased portion of the text, well, tough luck. I mean, the Taliban has been quite clear that what the Taliban's position is. This is the agreement. We follow the agreement to the letter. So to me, this strikes me as just more whining by U.S. military officials. Remember, they whined about how the Taliban didn't reduce violence and how that was a violation of the deal. But go ahead and read the deal. There's nothing in there whatsoever that says the Taliban needs to reduce violence. The Taliban commitment to not attack U.S. forces, so-called commitment, really is just sort of I think it's something they, sort of a nod and a wink. They said they won't do it, but again, they're not obligated to do that. It's not in this deal. Things that are behind the scenes. How can you defend that? You'd have to release that. The Taliban is denying it. So look, I want to take a shower every time I have to say this, but the Taliban has held up to its end.
Well, again, as far as we know, now there may be this unreleased annex or annexes that say, because listen, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told the press when he's questioned about this, that the unreleased annexes talk about the American moving military personnel around and how they're going to basically shift resources and where they're going to be in the military bases. My presumption reading his comments is that there was some understanding that the Taliban wasn't going to attack Americans as they do that, right? And sort of, but the point is here, the point is in this reporting, and I'm not blaming the reporter or anything like that, but we're skipping some steps here in terms of demonstrating that there's a violation of the agreement, because if you go to the actual text of the agreement released to Americans, who I think have the right to see the whole thing, and there's nothing in there about this. There's nothing about any of these camps in there. So, again, maybe the Taliban did violate some provisions in the unreleased portion of the text, but in terms of what we can see, well, I can't really say that.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Taliban will deny it all day long. So here's another possibility here. These bases usually have both U.S. and Afghan forces.
That's certainly the case of Camp Bastion. So,
exactly. So the Taliban can always just come out and say, well, we are targeting Afghan forces.
Which again is most explicitly not included in any part of the agreement, right? We know that there's no violation of that anywhere. That was never a part. Taliban never agreed to that at all.
This is just one of the multiple reasons why this is a bad deal. The U.S. can whine and complain that the Taliban's violating it, but what is out there and what the Taliban claims is the official deal, the Taliban winds up being right when you look at the text of that agreement. If it was something else important,
they're right in certain cases, but remember too, they also lie about Al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan. So they're lying about certain stuff here too. I mean,
yes, absolutely.
It's like
they're pretending Al-Qaeda,
but it's been 6 months since this agreement was signed between the Taliban and the U.S. in Doha. It was signed February 29th. We're sitting here recording this on August 31st, so it's been 6 months. And we're still not aware of any evidence of a break between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which is what Zalmay Khalilzad, the special representative for this, sold the American public, which Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sold the American public. It's been 6 months. Nobody could point to any evidence of any kind of break or renunciation or anything like that. The top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General Scott Miller, recently told Afghan television, One TV, he said, "There's a debate on their ties with Al-Qaeda, and we will continue to watch those. There are very strict commitments there, and they must be upheld." This is what he said. right? That's the quote on one TV. Now, what I found interesting about that is if you read the agreement again, I don't find the commitments very strict at all. In fact, I found multiple ways you can read around it, read around those provisions. The only time Al Qaeda is specifically mentioned has to do with preventing them from attacking the U.S., which we know the Taliban has lied about since the 1990s. So I don't know why anybody would think there's anything strict there. There's certainly no enforcement or verification mechanisms in anything that's been released to the public. Again, maybe there's some magical annex that includes this stuff. Nothing we've seen, right? So I don't know what General Miller's talking about there.
And Congresspersons who saw that annex said that is not in there. Look, Tom, actually, I'm right about the Taliban adhering to the letter of this deal because, as you said, there's nothing in there that says Al Qaeda can't be in Afghanistan.
Well, the thing is, though, is you can read certain provisions.
All they say is that they can't conduct attacks
their provisions
against the West.
There are provisions in there that say that any terrorists that threaten the U.S. or its allies can't fundraise, recruit, train, etc. Those are in the agreement, right? That's what they say. Yeah. The thing about those provisions is it doesn't specifically say Al Qaeda in those provisions. This says it above, right?
Right.
But I mean, certainly Al Qaeda would be included in those provisions if you were being honest about what those provisions meant, right?
Well, if it was a good deal, then you would actually name them. But my whole point about this is that it's such a bad deal that this should be so easy to make the case. But it's so poorly worded. It's
very poorly worded.
It's very poorly worded. We've signed deals for loans for our cars that were more descriptive
when I've leased
longer.
a car from Enterprise or one of those other car rental places, I don't even know if I can. This is an advertisement for those places. Although if you'd like to advertise on Generation Jihad, you can contact us. But the thing is that when I sign those lease agreements, or the rental agreements, I should say, they're far more comprehensive than this paperwork. But what I'm saying is that there are sort of provisions in there. For example, the second provision in there says the Taliban basically is agreed to not to cooperate with groups or individuals threatening the security of the United States and its allies. That's the second provision in this counterterrorism assurances. The third one says basically will prevent any group or individual in Afghanistan from threatening the security of the United States and its allies and will prevent them from recruiting, training, and fundraising and will not host them in accordance with the commitments in this agreement. Now, the point is that my point about this all along is, and you can read the other provisions sort of like that too, what this agreement should have said at a minimum is specifically Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, and enumerate them, explaining what they are. These groups will not be allowed to operate in Taliban territory, and we're going to take concrete steps to prevent them from doing so, right? That's not what the text says. It just basically is this more open-ended language, which allows the Taliban wiggle room to basically say, well, who threatens the United States? Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent is just, right now they're just with us attacking the Afghan government. They're not really a threat to the U.S. But that's where I think this gets dishonest and disingenuous in terms of this.
Yeah, that is my point, Tom. That's why it's so poorly worded that it can be interpreted. But it goes
beyond. But the thing is, it goes beyond just saying we're not going to let Al Qaeda attack the U.S. from Afghan soil. Yeah. It has these other provisions that should apply to Al Qaeda, but it's so poorly worded that basically there is wiggle room there. And the Taliban's supposed to make a statement saying that anybody threatens the U.S. doesn't, we have nothing to do with them. And of course, we haven't. That's one of the few things you could say is maybe concrete. And they haven't made any such statement. We're here 6 months out, and we haven't seen any statement like that from the Taliban yet. But here's why this matters, right? So the Defense Department's Inspector General's Office released a report in mid-August. So this is the Inspector General's Office of the DoD. This isn't just a long war journal. This is what the DoD, which wants out of Afghanistan and has endorsed this deal. And you got Scotty Miller saying there's a debate over this. Who the hell knows what he's talking about? But here's what the Inspector General's office says. So Sean W. O'Donnell, who's the acting Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Defense, in this report dated August 14th, it was released on August 18th. He says the United Nations Security Council and U.S. Central Command, that is U.S. CENTCOM, both reported that the Taliban remained supportive of Al Qaeda, even to the point of working together to attack Afghan security forces. That same report says same analysis by the Inspector General's office says reports published during the quarter, however, indicated that the Taliban continued a high tempo of attacks targeting the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, that's the ANDSF, and maintained its ties with Al-Qaeda, conducting some attacks alongside members of Al-Qaeda's regional affiliate, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. And of course, the same report goes on to cite General Kenneth McKenzie as talking about how the conditions have not been satisfied for a full withdrawal, and that the guarantee not to harbor Al-Qaeda had not yet been met. And the Inspector General's office says the DOD also cited an al-Qaeda claim that the Taliban and al-Qaeda conducted attacks together. So I don't know what the debate is that General Miller is talking about. We haven't seen any positive or affirmative evidence of a break between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. There was one commenter who sort of repeats the Taliban apologist talking points on some of my articles, including my newsletter, The Dispatch, who said, well, there's a debate over, whether or not the Taliban will allow al-Qaeda to attack the U.S. And I thought to myself, holy cow, if you guys are sitting there debating that at this point in 2020, then you are out to lunch, right? You're done. Mm-hmm. Because first of all, this is the same lie the Taliban said prior to 9/11 over and over again. Unless you have some sort of concrete evidence the Taliban is taking actions to restrain al-Qaeda, then this is a debate. It's just sort of pseudo-intellectual chin scratching, as opposed to really citing hard evidence. Now again, I'll change my opinion if I see real evidence, but apparently these people, decades worth of evidence doesn't change their opinion. And so if that's what they're talking about, well, the other point about that is al-Qaeda doesn't need to launch attack against the U.S. from Afghanistan like it did on 9/11. It's in multiple theaters, right? So even if al-Qaeda didn't attack us, let's say you have multiple workarounds in this case, right? Al-Qaeda could give an order for an attack from Afghanistan, but it's actually conducted from somewhere else. Al-Qaeda guys could cross the border into Pakistan and launch an attack against the U.S., or they could just launch an attack from somewhere else in part of Al-Qaeda's global network. But making this the centerpiece of all this just shows that these people don't really have an understanding of the overall thinking here, and also don't have an understanding of the tortuous tortuous U.S. attempts to get the Taliban to break with Al-Qaeda and to restrain Al-Qaeda, none of which, again, we haven't seen any evidence for that, and yet we have the Inspector General's Office of the Defense Department saying there's evidence going the other way.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't, Tom, I have nothing to add to that. You've encapsulated all my thoughts on that. Here's a case where the facts don't match up with the policy. The policy is we need to get the hell out of Afghanistan at any cost. We'll pretend that the Taliban is fulfilling some type of phantom obligation.
That's good, phantom obligation. I like that, yeah.
Yeah, and despite the fact what the Defense Department is saying about Taliban al-Qaeda ties, it's that simple. I mean, again, if you went out of Afghanistan, just like Iraq, just say you went out of Afghanistan, and we don't care that the Taliban will take over half the country within a year, that it's not in American interest to do so. Well, guess what? 20 years ago, it was in American interest, and we know what our enemy is capable of. We know what our enemy, what al-Qaeda and its allies want to do. If you think that ignoring them will make this problem go away, it'll just make them turn inward, then you don't understand these terrorist
What I would
groups.
say about that is the smarter case for getting out of Afghanistan, the smarter policy course is we're not going to pretend the Taliban is something it isn't. We're not going to endorse it as a de facto counterterrorism partner. Time's up. We're getting out. We've been here for a long time, and American people don't support this, and we don't have any political leadership that supports it, or very few political leaders who support it. Military leadership doesn't want to articulate it. We're getting out. You can make that decision, but we're not going to whitewash the Taliban on the way out. Those two things are not logically connected, right? You don't need to pretend the Taliban is something it isn't. Again, absent real evidence. If you have real evidence that you found a change in the Taliban's behavior and you can cite that, hey, the Lone War Journal will report it right away, right? Because it'd be a fantastic story to report, and it'll be the diplomatic achievement in the jihadi world, or again in the fight against jihadists, basically of all time. So go ahead and go for it. I would love to see it. But absent that sort of strong evidence, then you're just basically lying on the Taliban's behalf as you get out. Now, there's no reason for that. The smarter course is to just get out and say, look, we're going to play defense. We're not going to allow al-Qaeda or other terror. We're going to try and track however we can through intelligence means or whatever we've got, however we can. We're going to be travel restrictions or whatever. We're going to try and prevent al-Qaeda from coming and hitting us again from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and surrounding countries again going forward. Okay, you can make that case, and that our defenses are better now than they were on 9/11, and therefore we can play stronger defense. We know there are problems with those arguments, but those are legitimate arguments to make, right? What's not legitimate is to stand up the Taliban as our de facto counterterrorism partner, absent evidence that they are doing that, absent evidence that they are such a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, on the issue of travel, well, that's worked out so well, right? Designation after designation of Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders shows that these guys are able to move into the Gulf region for fundraising and recruiting and meetings at will, basically. How do they do this? They travel through Pakistan, which looks the other way. So if you think that, the interesting thing,
one little interesting thing on that, on Pakistan, that's true. But you remember one of bin Laden's last plots was that Mumbai-style attacks against Europe that they were plotting. Yunus al-Maritani and other guys were involved in plotting. Interestingly enough, we got from the court case, from the evidence out of Germany from one of the conspirators who was captured in that plot, actually those guys traveled through Iran because they feared that the Pakistanis would actually stop them from attacking inside Europe or committing a high-profile international terrorist attack. But they thought that the Iranian gateway was safer for them, which is interesting. It's, again, one of those things that's now whitewashed and all this. And makes me a warmonger, of course, for saying this. But right, but of course. But the point is that there are multiple ways they could go about doing this, and there's multiple problems with it for sure. But I say you could make the reasonable case that, look, we don't want to fight in Afghanistan anymore. We don't want American service members to play there anymore, and we're going to play defense, and we're going to just make sure our defenses are better than ever. We know there are problems with that argument, but that's better than holding up the Taliban as our guarantor, right? It's better than saying the Taliban is our security guarantor, right?
Yeah, pick the elements in the Afghan security forces, warlords, whatever. Arm them up and support them however you can. Oh, by the way, which just extends war. But hey, if that's what you want to do, that endless war won't end. It's just the U.S. involvement in it. But that's fine if that's what you want to do. Just make the case for it. But guess what? If an attack emanates from Afghanistan against either the homeland or against U.S. interests throughout the world, own that. Because your policies allowed, were permitted that.
I think, the bigger threat to me, the bigger problem to me than a specific attack. I mean, I think the threats.
Oh, yeah, I do understand.
I think it basically rises. It basically, if the jihadists are able to succeed, the Taliban al-Qaeda axis is able to win and reconstitute the emirate in Afghanistan. Yeah. I think that raises the tide of jihadism globally in a way that basically the victor's message goes out. And that creates a problem for us in terms of now all these jihadis are looking at this thinking, oh, wow, they defeated the Americans just like they defeated the Soviets, even though we know that's not directly true. There's all sorts of loopholes there and problems with that analogy. But that's going to be the argument that Mujahideen won once again. And basically, we're ascendant. That victor's message is what ISIS played off of in building the caliphate and attracting people to it. You can see a similar type of message emanating from Central South Asia. I think that could be a big problem for us in the long run and keep, by the way, the endless wars going, the endless jihad going, and give it a boost once again, So that's all a big bundle of problems there. They've got a lot of stumbling blocks in their way from executing another 9/11 style attack. Of course they do. Doesn't mean that those stumbling blocks are always going to work. They could fail. There's a lot of security measures we have in place to stop this sort of thing. But it just doesn't make sense to pretend the Taliban is the one that's going to stop it for us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how can we trust them? Look, I'll make one more point before we move on. Keep in mind, remember the Shorabak camp raid? That was one of the largest. There was 2 camps in Shorabak district in Kandahar. The U.S. didn't know about it until it conducted another operation. That was Al-Qaeda. It was a large Al-Qaeda camp. They didn't know about Shorabak, that it existed while the United States is in country. It didn't know about 2 significant Al-Qaeda training camps operating in Kandahar province until we conducted a raid against another Al-Qaeda operative and another Al-Qaeda encampment, which was in Paktia province. I can't remember which. Doesn't
Eastern
really
Afghanistan,
matter.
anyway.
Neighboring. It was Eastern. Yeah, let's call it Eastern Afghanistan. That's think about that. Think about how blind we are while we're there. Now think about how blind we will be.
Yeah, that's a point I've raised in congressional testimony and elsewhere too, is that, the U.S. has had a hard time being able to figure out what Al-Qaeda's presence looks like in Afghanistan with forces there. You think that's going to get better or easier with forces gone?
Yep.
Now that's not an argument for them to stay, by the way, because the assessments have been pretty poor through the years with American having larger forces there. So I can't say that's an argument in favor of a continued American presence. It just means that when it comes to ensuring that there's no threat to U.S. interests abroad or allies, whatever, I think that becomes even a thornier problem for us once the American forces depart, although it's a problem now. Again, that there's a number of different ways, a number of different platforms that Al-Qaeda or ISIS could use to attack us from. They don't necessarily need to do it from Afghanistan and Pakistan, although that is an area of the world that is, as U.S. officials occasionally point out correctly, teeming with jihadists and terrorists. Pakistan is still one of the places where I am fearful in the long run of what's coming out of Pakistan, just from all the problems there. And again, the victor's message out of Afghanistan, what does that do with the Frankenstein monster that originated in Pakistan in terms of jihadis? How does that then turn against its host? We'll see. We're going to find out, I fear. So let's get to the last point here on Afghanistan to wrap up this week's episode. It's this, you pointed this Bill, to this report about these targeted killings in Afghanistan and the Taliban's denying responsibility. But why don't you get into that? Why don't you take that a little bit? Give us a little bit of history on that.
Yeah, so right now we're seeing an uptick. We're seeing assassinations of basically in civil society in Afghanistan. Professors, lawyers, people, journalists, people who support women's rights or nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. They're being assassinated. They said that there's been a very large uptick. Apparently 49 have been killed so far this year. Now, look, assassinations, it's not something new. It's a standard guerrilla tactic, but it's one that the Taliban has effectively implemented over the years. And look, we know these attacks, they're certainly carried out by the Taliban. The Taliban doesn't want to take credit for them because it makes them look bad as they're getting ready to head to intra-Afghan talks, which, remember, is not just talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. It's only the Afghan government is only a element of that. Then the rest of civil society is supposed to be involved. So the Taliban's been doing it for years. But the primary target in should I say, the more prominent targets of these attacks have been individuals in the security services or government officials. General Razik was assassinated several years ago. He's he was the security police chief in Kandahar province, a staunch American ally, a hater of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They killed him. Like you go on and on about political and military leaders who've been targeted. But now the Taliban's getting a little more granular here. They're going after the individuals that are, say, a tier or two below that. I think this is, and this is something, by the way, that the Taliban in Pakistan did with great effect when it took control of North and South Waziristan, then the rest of the tribal areas, and then including throughout the north. There was a number of districts throughout what was then the Northwest Frontier Province. It's now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. They killed clerics, they killed politicians, they killed police chiefs, military leaders. The Taliban were extremely efficient, and it basically removed all opposition. I think, Tom and my opinion on this is very simple. The Taliban is not sincere in its talks, in that it's going to conduct actual peace talks. I think what you're seeing here is they're weakening and intimidating civil society, which is going to be going into these so-called peace talks. They're really withdrawal talks, but they're supposed to be peace talks between the Taliban and Afghan society. I can't say the Afghan government again. So I think they're attempting to silence that element during these talks, and then they're laying the groundwork for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, for the return of the Taliban's government. They're going to remove anyone who could stand in their way. You do it when you conduct a campaign like this. You do it from high, and you do it from the middle, and you do it down low. And when you want to remove any opposition, you remove those who could stand in your way. That's what I think we're seeing now.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can see this in UN reporting and other U.S. government reports too, that basically they've been hollowing out the opposition, both religious opposition and other civil society opponents of the Taliban's rule, basically paving the way for the Islamic Emirate, which, again, we don't see any evidence so far, 6 months into the U.S.-Taliban deal, that the Taliban is willing to walk its way back from that. So we're recording this on August 31st. I'm really hoping for the week of September 11th we can do something on Osama bin Laden's files. I'm desperately trying to get the time to do this, to pull it together, just to talk about sort of bin Laden's final year of life. We're definitely going to do that at some point. I'm hoping we can do that by the anniversary of 9/11 this year. Maybe not. We'll see. I got too many things I'm doing right now, right, Bill? So
it's never ending.
But we're working on a timeline of what that looks like, and we're going to dispel some myths about bin Laden's final months and some myths about Al Qaeda and how it operated at the time. Of course, it's evolved since then. But the simple fact of the matter is, Al Qaeda is going to continue fighting, and ISIS is going to continue fighting. You have some in America that says America shouldn't fight anymore. Okay, make the arguments and explain why you think that's the case, and make that to the American people, and say you want to own it. And then when something bad happens, make sure you own it. If another, we heard this, not to repeat ourselves, but we heard this, didn't we, Bill, back in 2011, 2012, a leading counterterrorism analyst, Peter Bergen, was on CNN, told us in a debate that we had at New America that it was over, right? It was all over. The jihad was all over. Yeah. There's this temptation to constantly say it's all over. We heard over and over again from people that it's all over. And of course, it wasn't over then, and it's not over now. And, America can end its role in the endless wars, but the endless jihad is going to continue.
Absolutely.
All right, so we're going to leave it on that note. Again, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. By the way, I've never actually used Spotify. Have you used Spotify?
I use Spotify all the time to listen to my music, though.
Yeah, and I'm terrible with technology.
Oh, it's great, Tom. You got to use Spotify.
I'll probably crash
not
as soon as I download it.
Yeah, listen, it's not an advertisement by Spotify, but Spotify, if you want to, send a little our way, we're happy to do it. But it is a fantastic app. I do use it for music. I don't use it for podcasts, but I think I will. You recommended one for me yesterday, and I'm going to give that a go on Spotify.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for listening.